The sun rose over the Jezreel Valley in the spring of 1457 BCE, illuminating what would become one of the most decisive battles in ancient history. Thutmose III, the warrior pharaoh of Egypt's 18th dynasty, stood at the precipice of his greatest military triumph. Before him lay the fortified city of Megiddo, and behind its walls cowered the largest coalition of Canaanite forces ever assembled. Approximately 70,000 warriors drawn from hundreds of city-states across the Levant. What transpired over the following weeks would not only cement Thutmose's reputation as one of history's greatest military commanders, but would also establish Egyptian dominance over the Near East for generations to come. The road to Megiddo. A dynasty in transition. To understand the magnitude of Thutmose III's victory, we must first examine the circumstances that brought Egypt's army to the gates of Megiddo. Thutmose III had endured a long and frustrating period of co-regency with his stepmother and aunt, Hatshepsut, who had effectively sidelined him from power for over 2 decades. During her reign, Hatshepsut focused primarily on trade, monumental building projects, and diplomatic relations rather than military expansion. While Egypt remained prosperous, its vassals in Canaan and Syria began to question Egyptian authority. When Hatshepsut died around 1458 BCE, Thutmose III finally assumed sole control of Egypt. He inherited a kingdom that was wealthy and stable, but faced a serious challenge to its imperial ambitions. The king of Kadesh, a powerful Syrian city-state, had organized a massive rebellion against Egyptian hegemony. This was not a simple uprising of disgruntled vassals. It was a coordinated effort to permanently break Egyptian influence in the region and establish an independent Canaanite-Syrian power bloc. The rebellion's timing was calculated. The conspirators assumed that a young pharaoh newly come to sole power would be inexperienced and potentially weak. They could not have been more mistaken. Thutmose III had spent his years of forced inactivity training with the military, studying the campaigns of his grandfather Thutmose I, and planning for the day when he would command Egypt's armies. When news of the rebellion reached Thebes, the pharaoh's response was immediate and decisive. The strategic genius. Planning the campaign. Thutmose III understood that crushing this rebellion required more than just military might. It demanded strategic brilliance. The coalition had chosen Megiddo as their rallying point with considerable strategic wisdom. Located at a critical junction of ancient trade routes in the Jezreel Valley, Megiddo controlled access to the coastal plain and the interior highlands. Its position made it naturally defensible, and its walls could shelter a massive army. The rebels clearly intended to force Egypt into a protracted siege, or, better yet, to draw the Egyptian army into an ambush in the surrounding terrain. The pharaoh mobilized his forces with remarkable speed. Egyptian records, particularly the detailed accounts carved on the walls of the Temple of Amun at Karnak, provide us with an unprecedented glimpse into ancient military logistics. Thutmose assembled an army that likely numbered between 10,000 and 20,000 men, though some estimates place it higher. This force included elite chariot squadrons, professional infantry divisions, Nubian archers, and auxiliary troops from Egypt's dependencies. The march from Egypt to Canaan covered approximately 250 miles and took just over 3 weeks, an impressive feat of logistics for an ancient army. Thutmose personally led his forces, establishing command posts at Gaza and then at Yehem, a town located about 15 miles from Megiddo. It was at Yehem that the pharaoh faced his first critical strategic decision, one that would reveal his tactical genius and set the stage for his overwhelming victory. The Aruna Pass. A calculated risk intelligence reports confirmed that the Canaanite coalition knew the Egyptians were coming. The rebels had positioned forces to block the two main routes to Megiddo, a northern road through Tanakh and a southern road through Zefti. Both routes were wide enough to accommodate a large army, but could easily be defended by smaller forces positioned on the high ground. The coalition commanders expected Thutmose to choose one of these conventional approaches, and they had prepared accordingly. Instead, Thutmose proposed what his own officers considered near suicidal: marching through the Aruna Pass, a narrow mountain defile that led directly to Megiddo. According to the Karnak inscriptions, his generals pleaded with him to reconsider. The pass was so narrow that the army would have to march in single file for much of the route. If the enemy discovered their approach and attacked while the Egyptian forces were strung out through the mountains, the entire army could be destroyed piecemeal. It was the kind of decision that could make Thutmose either a hero or the Pharaoh who destroyed Egypt's military might in a single catastrophic blunder. The historical records preserve the Pharaoh's response to his anxious commanders. Thutmose essentially argued that the very danger of the route made it the safest choice. The enemy would expect him to take one of the easier roads precisely because they were easier. The Aruna Pass was so dangerous that the coalition would never anticipate he would use it. Moreover, if they did have forces watching the pass, they would be a token guard rather than a substantial army, and the Egyptians could overwhelm them before they could raise an alarm. This reasoning reflects a sophisticated understanding of strategic psychology that would not be out of place in a modern military academy. Thutmose was engaging in what we might today call fourth-dimensional chess, not just anticipating his enemy's moves, but anticipating what they would expect him to anticipate. To emphasize his confidence in the plan, the Pharaoh announced that he would personally lead the column through the pass, positioning himself at the greatest point of danger. The march through Aruna was tense, but ultimately successful. The narrow defile was indeed lightly guarded, and what few enemy scouts were present fled without giving significant warning to the main Canaanite force. As the Egyptian army emerged from the mountains onto the plain before Megiddo, they achieved complete tactical surprise. The bulk of the coalition army was positioned to block the northern and southern approaches, expecting to fight a defensive battle on ground of their choosing. Instead, they suddenly found 10,000 to 20,000 Egyptian soldiers deployed between them and their fortified base at Megiddo. The Battle of Megiddo. Tactics and triumph. The initial confusion among the Canaanite forces gave Thutmose a crucial advantage, but he still faced daunting odds. Even if we accept the lower estimates of coalition strength, perhaps 40,000 to 50,000 warriors, rather than 70,000, the Egyptians were significantly outnumbered. The question was whether they could leverage their superior training, equipment, and leadership to overcome this numerical disadvantage. Thutmose ordered his army to make camp on the plain, allowing his soldiers to rest after their march while simultaneously demonstrating his complete confidence in their position. This psychological warfare was deliberate. The Pharaoh wanted the coalition commanders to see that he was not intimidated by their numbers. The next morning, as dawn broke over the valley, the Egyptian army formed for battle in a formation that showcased the military innovations that made Egypt the superpower of its age. The Egyptian battle line was anchored by its chariot corps, the ancient world's equivalent of armored cavalry. These were not the heavy chariots of later Near Eastern armies, but relatively light two-wheeled vehicles carrying a driver and an archer or spearman. Their speed and mobility made them devastating on open terrain. Thutmose positioned chariot squadrons on both flanks of his formation, where they could exploit any weakness in the enemy line and potentially encircle Canaanite forces. The center of the Egyptian line consisted of disciplined infantry formations. These were professional soldiers, not conscripted farmers, and they carried bronze-tipped spears, axes, and large shields. Many wore scale armor or padded linen armor, giving them better protection than their Canaanite counterparts. Behind the main infantry line stood the archers, equipped with composite bows capable of sending arrows hundreds of yards with deadly accuracy. The Canaanite coalition, despite its numerical superiority, faced several critical disadvantages. First, it was not a unified army, but rather a collection of contingents from different city-states, each with its own commander and its own tactical traditions. Coordination among these diverse forces was difficult even under the best circumstances. Second, many of the coalition warriors were militia rather than professional soldiers, giving them less training and discipline than their Egyptian opponents. Third, the coalition had been caught out of position by Thutmose's unexpected approach, and they had to rapidly redeploy from their defensive positions to confront the Egyptian army on the plain. According to the Egyptian accounts, Thutmose himself led the charge when battle was joined. This was not mere royal propaganda. Egyptian pharaohs of the New Kingdom period routinely fought alongside their troops, and leading from the front was considered an essential demonstration of royal courage and divine favor. The pharaoh likely commanded the central chariot squadron, the most prestigious position on the battlefield. The battle began with volleys of arrows darkening the sky as both sides' archers sought to thin enemy ranks before the lines clashed. The Egyptian composite bows had superior range and penetrating power, allowing them to inflict casualties while remaining relatively safe from Canaanite return fire. As the lines closed, the chariot squadrons accelerated to attack speed, their crews launching javelins and arrows into the enemy formation before wheeling away to make room for the infantry assault. The Egyptian infantry advanced in disciplined formation, their shields overlapping to create a moving wall. When they collided with the Canaanite line, the battle became a brutal test of training, equipment, and morale. The superior armor and weapons of the Egyptian soldiers gave them an edge in individual combat, while their training allowed them to maintain formation even in the chaos of melee combat. The Canaanite forces, despite their courage and numerical advantage, began to falter. The decisive moment came when the Egyptian chariot squadrons completed a sweeping maneuver around the Canaanite flanks and attacked from the sides and rear. This classic envelopment tactic, which would be used by great commanders throughout history from Hannibal to Napoleon, transformed an Egyptian advantage into a Canaanite catastrophe. Coalition warriors who had been pressed from the front suddenly found themselves surrounded and attacked from multiple directions. Panic rippled through the Canaanite ranks. What followed was the kind of rout that ancient warfare could produce when one army's morale completely collapsed. Thousands of coalition soldiers broke formation and ran, desperately trying to reach the safety of Megiddo's walls before the Egyptian chariots could ride them down. The Egyptian records describe scenes of chaos as warriors threw away their weapons and armor to run faster, trampling their own comrades in their panic. The pharaoh's charioteers pursued relentlessly, cutting down fleeing soldiers and capturing those who surrendered. The Siege of Megiddo. Victory through patience. The Canaanite flight created a critical moment that would haunt Egyptian military planners for years to come. In their desperation to escape the battlefield, coalition soldiers converged on Megiddo's gates in a disorganized mob. The city's defenders, terrified by the approaching Egyptian army, were slow to open the gates. Coalition warriors had to be hauled up the walls on ropes made from clothing and bedsheets in scenes of desperate confusion. Egyptian forces were initially caught up in the excitement of victory, stopping to loot the abandoned Canaanite camp rather than immediately pursuing the routed enemy. This gave just enough time for the bulk of the coalition army to find refuge behind Megiddo's walls. Later, Egyptian records from the Karnak temple inscriptions include what appears to be a rueful acknowledgement of this missed opportunity. Had the Egyptians pressed their pursuit immediately, they might have broken into Megiddo alongside the fleeing coalition troops and ended the campaign in a single day. Instead, Thutmose found himself facing a siege. Megiddo's walls were formidable, and behind them sheltered not only the remnants of the coalition army, but also the leadership of the rebellion, including the king of Kadesh himself. The pharaoh demonstrated the same strategic patience he had shown in planning the campaign. Rather than waste his army in costly assaults against strong fortifications, he ordered the construction of a siege wall completely encircling the city. This circumvallation was a massive engineering project. The siege wall cut Megiddo off from any hope of resupply or reinforcement, turning the city's large population from an asset into a liability. More mouths to feed meant the city's food stores would be exhausted more quickly. Thutmose could afford to wait. His supply lines to Egypt were secure, and no relieving army was going to come to Megiddo's aid. All the other Canaanite cities had sent their warriors to join the coalition, and those warriors were now trapped inside Megiddo or dead on the battlefield. The siege lasted approximately 7 to 8 months, an eternity by the standards of ancient warfare. During this time, Thutmose used both military pressure and psychological warfare to break the defenders' will. Regular assaults tested the walls without committing to a full-scale attack, keeping the defenders in constant tension. Egyptian archers maintained steady harassing fire, making it dangerous for anyone to show themselves on the walls. Meanwhile, the pharaoh's engineers dug siege tunnels and constructed siege towers, demonstrating that he had the means to eventually breach the fortifications if starvation did not force surrender first. Inside Megiddo, conditions deteriorated rapidly. The city had not been provisioned for a long siege with such a large population. Food stocks dwindled, then disappeared. Disease, the inevitable companion of siege warfare in the ancient world, began to spread through the overcrowded city. Coalition commanders who had spoken so boldly of resisting Egyptian tyranny now faced the reality of watching their people starve. Finally, the city's leaders sued for peace. The king of Kadesh, architect of the rebellion, managed to escape during the negotiations, a fact that clearly irritated the Egyptian record-keepers who documented the campaign. But the rest of the coalition leadership surrendered themselves to Thutmose's mercy. The gates of Megiddo opened, and the Egyptian army marched in to claim their victory. The spoils of war. Egypt's triumph. The plunder taken from Megiddo was staggering and provides clear evidence of both the wealth of Canaanite civilization and the scale of the coalition that had gathered there. The detailed inventory preserved in the Karnak inscriptions reads like an ancient quartermaster's fever dream. The Egyptians captured 924 chariots, including 2 overlaid with gold that belonged to the king of Megiddo and the prince of Kadesh. They took 2,238 horses, 200 suits of armor, 502 bows, and 200,000 cattle and sheep. The strategic implications of these numbers are profound. The capture of nearly 1,000 chariots represented a significant portion of the coalition's military capability. Chariots were expensive military assets in the Bronze Age, requiring not just the vehicle itself, but trained horses and skilled crews. By capturing or destroying this chariot force, Thutmose had essentially eliminated the Canaanite city's ability to field competitive armies for years to come. Beyond the military hardware, the Egyptians also seized vast quantities of gold, silver, and precious goods. The coalition leaders and city-states that had rebelled against Egypt were forced to pay heavy tribute both as immediate reparations and as ongoing annual payments. This wealth flowed back to Egypt, funding further military campaigns and the massive building projects that characterized Thutmose III's long reign. Perhaps more importantly, the pharaoh took hostages, specifically the sons and heirs of the defeated coalition leaders. These young princes were transported to Egypt, where they would be educated at the royal court in Thebes. This was a brilliantly effective policy for ensuring long-term loyalty. The hostage princes learned Egyptian customs, culture, and language. Many came to admire Egyptian civilization and developed personal relationships with Egyptian officials. When they eventually returned to inherit their fathers' thrones, they were far less likely to rebel against Egypt because they had been socialized to see themselves as part of the Egyptian world order. The broader campaign, securing the victory. The fall of Megiddo was the decisive moment of the campaign, but it was not the end of Thutmose's military operations in the region. The pharaoh understood that military victory had to be consolidated through political and administrative measures. Over the following months, Egyptian armies moved systematically through Canaan and southern Syria, securing submission from cities that had supported the rebellion and reinforcing the loyalty of those that had remained faithful to Egypt. Thutmose established or reinforced Egyptian garrisons at strategic locations throughout the Levant. These were not merely military outposts, but administrative centers that would oversee Egyptian interests in the region. Egyptian officials were appointed to supervise tribute collection, settle disputes between local rulers, and ensure that trade routes remained open and secure. The pharaoh transformed his military conquest into a functioning imperial administration with remarkable efficiency. The diplomatic aftermath of Megiddo was equally important. Thutmose received envoys from kingdoms and city-states across the Near East, all seeking to make peace with Egypt or confirm their existing alliances. The message was clear. Egypt was the dominant military power in the region, and opposing Egyptian interests was futile. Even kingdoms that had not participated in the rebellion, including some in distant Anatolia and Mesopotamia, sent gifts and diplomatic communications acknowledging Egyptian preeminence. This diplomatic success was built on the foundation of Thutmose's military reputation. The victory at Megiddo demonstrated several things to the ancient world. First, Egypt could mobilize, supply, and command large armies over considerable distances. Second, Egyptian tactical and strategic thinking was sophisticated enough to overcome numerical disadvantages through superior planning and execution. Third, and perhaps most important, the pharaoh himself was a capable military leader willing to share the dangers of combat with his troops. This personal courage was essential to maintaining the loyalty and fighting spirit of the Egyptian army. The legacy. Thutmose III's military genius. The Battle of Megiddo and the subsequent campaign established Thutmose III as one of history's great military commanders. His strategic acumen rivals that of more famous generals like Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar, and his tactical innovations would influence warfare in the ancient Near East for centuries. The pharaoh conducted 17 military campaigns during his 54-year reign, most of them building on the foundation established at Megiddo, and never suffered a significant defeat. Several aspects of Thutmose's generalship at Megiddo deserve particular attention. His decision to march through the Aruna Pass demonstrated a willingness to take calculated risks and an understanding of psychological warfare. By doing what the enemy considered impossible or foolhardy, he achieved surprise that compensated for his numerical disadvantage. This principle, that the most dangerous course of action may be the safest because it is unexpected, has been rediscovered by military commanders throughout history. His use of combined arms tactics, coordinating infantry, chariots, and archers to create mutually supporting formations showed sophisticated military thinking. The envelopment maneuver that broke the Canaanite line required careful timing and coordination between different units of his army, as well as subordinate commanders capable of executing complex maneuvers in the chaos of battle. The pharaoh's patience during the siege of Megiddo revealed strategic maturity. Many ancient commanders would have felt compelled to attempt immediate assaults against the city walls to maintain momentum and satisfy their troops' desire for more plunder. Thutmose recognized that time was on his side and that a methodical siege would ultimately yield complete victory at far less cost than repeated assaults. The political and administrative follow-through after the military victory demonstrated that Thutmose understood conquest required more than just winning battles. The hostage system, the garrison network, and the administrative infrastructure he established converted tactical military success into lasting strategic dominance. Conclusion: the Pharaoh who forged an empire. The destruction of the Canaanite coalition at Megiddo was more than just a military victory. It was the moment when Thutmose III transformed Egypt from a regional power into a genuine empire. The campaign demonstrated to the entire ancient Near East that Egypt possessed both the military capability and the political will to dominate the region. For nearly a century after Megiddo, Egyptian supremacy in Canaan and Syria remained largely unchallenged. The victory also had profound effects on Egypt itself. The wealth extracted from the conquered territories funded a golden age of temple building, artistic achievement, and economic prosperity. Thutmose used the spoils of his campaigns to glorify the god Amun and to legitimate his own rule, erasing the awkward questions about his relationship with Hatshepsut and establishing himself as one of Egypt's greatest pharaohs. The detailed records of the Megiddo campaign, preserved in the Karnak temple inscriptions, provide modern historians with an invaluable window into ancient warfare. The level of detail, down to specific numbers of captured animals and weapons, suggests that Egyptian military administration was remarkably sophisticated. The records were clearly kept not just for propaganda purposes, but also for practical accounting and planning for future campaigns. Thutmose III ruled Egypt for more than 5 decades after Megiddo, during which time he conducted numerous military campaigns and expanded Egyptian control deeper into Nubia and further into Syria. Yet none of his later victories had quite the same decisive impact as the crushing defeat he inflicted on the Canaanite coalition in 1457 BCE. That victory established the pattern and created the conditions for all that followed. In the end, the Battle of Megiddo stands as a testament to what military genius combined with disciplined troops and superior logistics could achieve in the ancient world. Thutmose III's army did not merely defeat 70,000 Canaanite warriors. They shattered a coalition, ended a rebellion, and forged an empire that would dominate the Near East for generations. The young pharaoh who had spent decades in his stepmother's shadow emerged from the Aruna Pass and the fields of Megiddo as one of history's greatest conquerors, a warrior king whose strategic brilliance and tactical skill would be studied and admired for millennia to come.